The porch boards groaned under Jonas Kettering's weight as he lowered himself down, back against the doorframe, legs stretched out into the last orange light of the day. Dust clung to his sleeves in gray streaks. His hands were raw. Not bleeding, just worn, the kind of raw that came from a full day of hauling broken furniture, rotted floorboards, and years of dead leaves, out of a house nobody had lived in for a long time. Behind him, the cabin stood a little straighter than it had that morning. Not fixed, just cleared. A start. Ember the mule stood near the fence post, ears flicking at nothing, patient the way old animals get when they've already seen a man work himself past sense. Somewhere out past the yard, the windmill leaned against the sky, its blades still, its frame silent. Not from lack of wind. There simply wasn't anything left inside it to turn. Jonas didn't look at it yet. He'd look at it tomorrow, when his hands weren't shaking from exhaustion and his eyes weren't half shut from a day that had started before sunrise. Tonight, he just sat. He let the ache settle into his shoulders. He watched the light go copper, then rust, then gray along the ridgeline. $10. That's what the ranch had cost him. $10, a dead windmill, a cabin that smelled like mice and old smoke, and 160 acres of ground everybody in town seemed to agree wasn't worth the walk out to see it. He almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it wasn't, and laughing was easier than the alternative. It hadn't always been this quiet around him. There had been a house once, smaller but full. His father's hands calloused from wagon work and harness leather, his mother's voice counting out sums at the supper table. There had been warmth in that house, the kind that didn't need explaining. Then the accident. The threshing machine, a stuck belt, his father reaching in at the wrong second. It happened fast enough that grief didn't have time to prepare anyone for it. After that, there had been a different kind of house. His aunt and uncle's house, where every meal he ate got written down somewhere. Where a boy's presence was measured out like feed for stock that hadn't yet proven it was worth keeping. And there had been Silas Otway, the old windmill man, the one who never raised his voice, never handed Jonas an answer he hadn't earned first. "Don't fix what you don't understand yet," Silas used to say, standing beside some farmer's broken pump with his arms crossed, waiting for Jonas to actually look before touching anything. Silas was gone now, too. Everyone eventually was. At 18, Jonas had been handed $10 across a table and told, in so many words, that the accounts were settled. Nothing owed either direction. He'd taken the money without arguing. There hadn't been anything left to argue about. He'd walked until the walking led him here, to a town that laughed when he spent every last cent on a dead ranch nobody else wanted, and to a windmill standing motionless against a sky that hadn't stopped moving in years. Jonas closed his eyes for just a moment there on the porch in the settling dark. Tomorrow, he'd start looking at what was actually wrong with it. Jonas Kettering was born on a small tenant farm outside a freight crossing town too small to appear on most maps. His father, Elias Kettering, worked the land by day and repaired other men's wagon wheels and harness leather by lamplight, trading skill for coin when the harvest didn't stretch far enough. His mother, Ruth Ellen, kept the household ledger with the same care she kept everything else. She taught Jonas his letters from seed catalogs and his numbers from the tally marks scratched into the barn post each planting season. It wasn't a rich house, but it was a full one. Supper was never quiet. Elias talked with his hands as much as his mouth, sketching the shape of a wagon axle in the air to explain why a wheel had failed, or holding two fingers apart to show Jonas exactly how much play a good harness strap needed, and no more. The machines never lied, his father used to say, long before Jonas understood what that meant. They just told you the truth in a language most men were too impatient to learn. Jonas was 12 the autumn a belt caught wrong on the threshing machine 2 farms over, where his father had gone to help finish a neighbor's harvest before the weather turned. Nobody blamed the machine. Machines didn't reach into their own gears. But it was the machine that took him, all the same, in the space of a moment, too fast for anyone to shout a warning that would have mattered. His mother lived 11 months longer. Grief has its own kind of arithmetic, and hers ran out before the year did. She died quietly, in her sleep, the ledger she'd kept so carefully still open on the kitchen table to a page half finished. At 13, Jonas went to live with his father's cousin, a stiff, practical man named Warren Ashcroft, who ran a mercantile 2 towns west and had never particularly wanted children in his house. Warren wasn't cruel. He simply kept accounts, on paper and otherwise, and Jonas quickly understood which column he belonged in. Food, counted. Boots, counted. A cot in the storeroom, counted. Warren never said the word debt aloud in front of him, but Jonas saw it anyway, in the way every kindness in that house arrived with a faint, unspoken interest rate attached. It was Warren who, tired of an idle nephew underfoot, sent Jonas 2 afternoons a week to help an old windmill repairman named Silas Otway, mostly to get him out of the store. Silas fixed pumps and mills for half the farms in the county, traveling a slow circuit with a mule-drawn cart of tools that rattled louder than it needed to. Silas didn't talk much the first few weeks. He'd hand Jonas a wrench, point at a bolt, and wait. He noticed, eventually, that the boy didn't reach for tools the way most boys did, grabbing, forcing, hoping. Jonas watched first. He listened to the way a gear turned before he touched it. "Don't fix what you don't understand yet," Silas told him, the first time Jonas nearly stripped a bolt trying to force a stuck flywheel. "You go in blind, you just add a second problem to the first one." It became the only rule that mattered between them. Silas taught him to read the wind before he read the machine, how a mill's blades should answer a breeze without hesitation, and what it meant when they didn't. He taught him the sound of a healthy gear train, low and even, and the sound of one wearing itself down, a faint grinding under the turn that most men never noticed until the whole mechanism seized. He taught him patience with rust and impatience with guessing. 4 years passed that way. Warren's mercantile, and 2 afternoons that stretched into most days, out among windmills and hand pumps scattered across dry country. Jonas grew taller, quieter, steadier with his hands. Silas grew older, slower, his cough settling deeper into his chest each winter. On a gray morning in early spring, Silas didn't come to open the cart. Jonas found him in his shed, halfway through disassembling a gearbox that would never be finished, his tools laid out in the same careful order he always kept them. There was no long goodbye. There hadn't needed to be one. Silas left Jonas the tool chest, the mule, an old, unhurried animal named Ember, and nothing else, because there hadn't been anything else to leave. Warren allowed Jonas to keep both, mostly because neither the tools nor the mule fit into any column he cared to manage. 6 months later, Warren sold the mercantile. The new owner didn't need extra hands, and Warren, settling his accounts one final time, called Jonas into the back room where the ledger was kept. It didn't take long. Warren slid a thin envelope across the counter. $10, the balance of whatever arithmetic he'd been keeping for the past 5 years. Food and lodging weighed against nothing Jonas had ever been given a chance to argue. "We're square," Warren said. "Not unkind. Not kind either. Just finished." Jonas took the envelope. He packed the tool chest, a blanket, a few days of food, and led Ember out past the mercantile's front step without looking back at the window where Warren stood watching him go. He walked southwest for the better part of 2 weeks, working small repairs along the way. A wagon pin here, a stuck pump handle there, trading labor for a meal or a place to sleep. It was in a dusty crossroads town, half a day's walk past the last farm he'd fixed a windlass for, that he first heard men laughing about a dead ranch nobody would touch. The land office in Millbrook Crossing smelled of tobacco and old paper. Behind a scarred counter sat a clerk named Otis Bramwell, a heavy-set man with ink-stained fingers who looked up at Jonas the way most men looked up at anyone who wasn't buying anything worth their time. "I heard there's a claim gone abandoned near the ridge," Jonas said. "The one with the windmill." Bramwell's mouth twitched into something close to a smile. "The Voss place." He said the name like it explained everything by itself. 10 years, maybe more, nobody's touched it. Mill's been dead since before I had gray in my beard. Ground's thin, water's worse. He studied Jonas for a moment, the dust on his coat, the tool chest strapped behind Ember's saddle. "You looking to farm, or looking to lose money slower than most?" "How much?" "Back taxes and the filing fee. Comes to $10 even." Somewhere behind Jonas, near the door, two men who'd been leaning against the porch rail laughed. Not unkindly, exactly, just the easy laugh of men who'd already made up their minds about how the story ended. Jonas didn't turn around. He set the envelope on the counter and counted out every dollar he had left in the world. Bramwell slid the paper across. "Don't say nobody warned you." Outside, the laughter followed him partway down the street. Jonas kept his eyes ahead, leaving Ember by the rope, and didn't notice, or didn't let himself notice, the one face in the small crowd that wasn't laughing at all. A young woman stood near the mercantile steps, a grain sack balanced on one hip, watching him pass with an expression that wasn't pity and wasn't amusement either, just attention. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. By the time he reached the edge of town, he'd already forgotten the moment had happened. The ranch sat in a shallow basin below a low ridge, the kind of ground that looked, at a glance, like it had given up on itself. The cabin leaned slightly west, its sod roof torn open in one corner where weather had worked at it for years. A collapsed lean-to sagged against the north wall. And beyond the yard, standing against the late afternoon sky, was the windmill. Its tower still upright, still sound at the base, but its blades hanging crooked and still. The whole structure wearing the particular stillness of something that had simply stopped being useful a long time ago. Jonas didn't go to the windmill first. Silas had taught him better than that. He walked the ground the way Silas used to walk a farmer's field before ever touching a pump. Slow, quiet, eyes down. The soil near the dry wash behind the cabin held a darker color than the crust further up the slope. A thin stand of sage grew low and stubborn along a shallow depression that curved north of the barn, thicker there than anywhere else on the property. It wasn't much, but it wasn't nothing either. Water, however weak, was still moving somewhere beneath that ground. The land hadn't died. It had just stopped being asked the right questions. He turned to the windmill last, the way Silas would have wanted. Up close, the tower was better built than the rest of the ranch suggested. Solid cross braces, a platform that had held its shape despite years of neglect. But the gearbox at the head of the tower, the housing that should have carried the turning motion down into the pump rod below, was nearly empty. Not broken, not rusted through, empty, in a way that made Jonas stop and look twice. He climbed the ladder anyway, testing each rung before trusting his weight to it, and opened the housing at the top. Inside, the mounting bolts for the main drive gear were still there, still threaded, still clean where a gear should have sat. Clean in a way nothing else on this ranch was clean. No rust, no decade of dust settled into the threads. Someone had removed this gear train carefully, deliberately, and not particularly long before the ranch had fallen still. Windmills didn't fail like that. Windmills failed from neglect, from storms, from age creeping into iron until it gave. They didn't fail because someone had taken the heart out of them and walked away. Jonas stood on the platform a long moment, one hand resting on the empty housing, the wind moving steady and unbothered across the ridge below him. Wind enough to turn 3 mills, if there'd been anything left inside this one to catch it. Don't fix what you don't understand yet. He climbed back down before the light failed completely, unrolled his blanket on the cabin floor beside Ember's tack, and lay awake longer than he meant to, turning the question over the way Silas had taught him to turn over any problem that didn't yet have an honest answer. Somebody had taken this mill apart on purpose. The only thing Jonas didn't know yet was why. The name came to him in pieces, the way most things in a small town did. Never handed over whole, always passed along sideways, half-finished, in the middle of some other conversation. He heard it first from Bramwell when he returned to the land office to file a question about well rights. "Voss built that mill himself," the clerk said, not looking up from his ledger. "Abram Voss. Came through here, 12 years back?" 13? Man could fix anything with a gear in it. Farmers used to ride 2 days just to have and look at a busted pump. A pause. Lost the place to the bank, though. Ground never gave him enough to make the payments. Left before the last frost one year and never came back for the rest of his things. What happened to him? Bramwell shrugged, the particular shrug of a man repeating a story he'd never bothered to verify. Flash flood, way I heard it. Down in one of the washes east of here, maybe a year after he left, caught out in a storm that came up fast. Body was never found, but nobody expected it to be. He finally looked up. Why? You planning on digging him up along with that mill? Jonas didn't answer that. He thanked the clerk and left. Over the following weeks, the rest came slowly, the way water moved through ground that didn't want to give it up easily. An old rancher at the Mercantile remembered Voss working through the night more than once, lantern burning in the tower window long after every other light in the valley had gone dark. A woman selling eggs near the church recalled that Voss had been strange about that mill, proud of it in a way that seemed odd for a man losing his farm, refusing offers from neighbors who'd wanted to buy the gearing off him even after the bank had already claimed the land. None of it added up to an answer, but it added up to a shape, and a shape was where understanding always started. Back at the ranch, Jonas began taking the tower apart piece by piece, the way Silas had taught him to take apart anything he didn't yet understand. Slowly, in order, with every part laid out exactly where it had come from, so the machine could tell its own story without him getting in the way. In a gap behind the housing, wedged where it had likely fallen and been forgotten, he found a single gear, small and oddly shaped, its teeth cut at an angle he didn't recognize from any standard mill mechanism. The metal was worn smooth in a pattern that didn't match ordinary use, worn the way something gets worn when a hand has adjusted it, again and again, testing something. He found the marks next. Faint scratches on the drive shaft, evenly spaced, the kind a man makes when he's counting turns, timing something by hand instead of trusting the wind to do it evenly on its own. It took another week of turning the pieces over in his mind before the shape finally became an answer. An ordinary windmill gearing turned a pump rod fast when the wind was strong. That was the whole design. More water when the wind gave more push. But a weak shallow aquifer didn't work that way. Pump it too fast, and the water table dropped faster than the ground could feed it back, drawing the well down toward nothing before it had a chance to recover. Voss hadn't been fixing a broken mill. He'd been building a different one. A gear train that deliberately slowed and evened the pump stroke no matter how hard the wind pushed, keeping the draw gentle enough that the thin vein of water beneath this ranch could keep pace with it. It hadn't been an accident, the odd angle on that lone gear tooth. It had been years of a man teaching himself something nobody had taught him, the same way Jonas had learned from Silas, except Voss had no one. Just failure after failure, probably, each one costing him something, time, materials, another season closer to the bank's patience running out. And when the bank finally took the land anyway, Voss hadn't left the mechanism behind for the next owner to inherit. He'd taken it with him. Not out of spite, out of hope. A man planning to come back and buy the place again someday doesn't leave his best work sitting where anyone might carry it off. He just never got the chance. Jonas sat with that for a long while, the empty housing open in front of him, evening settling gray over the ridge. If I'm going to bring this mill back, he thought, I'm not restoring what Voss built. I have to figure it out myself, the same way he did. The first attempt failed within 2 days. He'd shaped a rough gear train from salvaged parts and mismatched teeth, close enough by eye but not by truth, and mounted it back into the housing with more confidence than the work deserved. The wind came up strong that afternoon, and for a moment the blades turned smooth, the pump rod dropping and rising in a rhythm that looked, for just a few minutes, like success. Then the mismatch caught. The gears ground against each other with a sound Jonas felt in his teeth before he heard it. And by the time he'd climbed the tower to release the brake, the pump had already drawn hard and fast for too long. When he checked the well the next morning, the water level had dropped further than it had been the day he'd first arrived. Pulled down too quickly, the thin vein unable to answer that fast a draw. It took 4 days for the water to climb back to where it had started. 4 days of rationing what little he had stored, of watering ember from the last of the barrel instead of the well, of sitting on the porch each evening doing the math on how much longer he could afford to be wrong. He didn't touch the gearing again until he understood, fully, why it had failed. Not the general shape of the mistake, but the exact tooth, the exact ratio, the exact reason the draw had come too fast. Only then did he cut a second set, slower this time, deliberately imperfect, toward caution rather than toward speed. Listen first, he told himself, climbing the tower again. Then fix. The second gear train held. It turned slower than Jonas expected, slower than felt natural watching the blades spin overhead. But the pump rod below rose and fell in a steady, patient rhythm. And when he checked the well that evening, the water hadn't dropped at all. It had held its level, drawn and answered in the same breath, the way Voss must have intended it to run all along. He didn't celebrate. He just sat by the trough and watched the water come, clear after the first few buckets, and let that be enough. 3 days later, a wagon came up the track toward the ranch, driven by a young woman Jonas recognized before he could place why. It was the same face from the crowd outside the land office, the one that hadn't laughed. "You're the one who bought the Voss place," she said, pulling the wagon to a stop near the trough. It wasn't a question. "Jonas Kettering. Ruth Calloway." She nodded toward the windmill, its blades turning easy overhead. "Didn't think anyone would get that thing running again. My sister and I are 2 miles east. Our well's been weak all summer. Figured I'd see if it was true before I believed it." She'd come, it turned out, for more than curiosity. Her sister's homestead sat closer to the same underground vein, and the well there had been struggling in ways that sounded familiar to Jonas the moment Ruth described them, drawing cloudy, then slow, then barely drawing at all some mornings. In exchange for a look at her family's pump and whatever advice he could offer, Ruth had brought a sack of seed and an offer of her own, an afternoon of work on Jonas's garden plot, in return for the same on hers later in the season. "I don't need help planting," Jonas said, not unkindly, just honestly. Silas had taught him gears and wind, not seed depth or soil. "That's exactly why you need help planting," Ruth said, and there wasn't any edge to it, just plain fact, the same way Silas used to state plain facts about a stuck bolt. Having water doesn't mean the ground will hold it. You can pull every drop from that well and still watch everything you put in the dirt shrivel by July if you don't know how to keep it there. She was right. And Jonas knew enough to recognize being right when he heard it. Over the following weeks, Ruth came by every few days, sometimes with her sister's boy trailing behind her, a quiet child of about 6, who liked to sit near the base of the windmill tower and watch the blades turn without ever seeming to tire of it. Ruth showed Jonas how to mound the soil around drought-hardy seed rather than plant it flat, how a thin layer of mulch cut from dry grass could hold moisture through the worst heat of the afternoon, how to read a wilting leaf and tell the difference between a plant that needed water and one that had simply had too much too fast. In return, Jonas walked the 2 miles east with her one afternoon and spent the better part of a day at her sister's homestead, working through the weak pump the same way he'd worked through his own, listening before touching, tracing the draw down through worn leather washers in a valve seat that had corroded past usefulness. It wasn't the elaborate mechanism Voss had built. It didn't need to be. A simple repair, done with attention instead of guesswork, brought the well back to a steady pull within the day. Ruth's sister, a quiet woman named Eleanor, who carried the tired watchfulness of someone managing a homestead and a young son with too little help, thanked him plainly and fed him supper before he walked back in the last of the evening light. The boy, whose name Jonas learned was Sam, followed him partway down the track, asking questions about the windmill until Ruth called him back. It was during one of those afternoons, weeding a row of beans Ruth had insisted would survive the season if he stopped drowning them out of nerves, that Jonas found the small wooden horse. It had been half buried near the collapsed lean-to, its paint long since weathered away, one wheel missing entirely. He turned it over in his hand for a long moment before setting it on the porch rail, where it stayed after that, facing the yard. He didn't know whose it had been. Voss had mentioned no children in anything Jonas had pieced together so far. But something about the worn shape of it, small enough to fit a child's grip, made him unwilling to just set it aside with the rest of the debris. He never mentioned it to Ruth. She never asked. But she noticed it one afternoon, sitting there on the rail, and said nothing at all, just glanced at it, then at Jonas, in a way that told him she understood exactly what kind of thing deserved to be left standing rather than thrown out. The warning didn't come as weather, it came as absence. The wind, which had blown steady across the ridge every day since Jonas had arrived, simply stopped, sometime past noon, leaving the windmill's blades to drift and slow and finally hang still against a sky gone the color of old iron. Ember refused to graze, standing instead near the barn with her head low and her ears pinned back toward the north. Out past the fence line, the birds that usually worked the fields in the late afternoon had gone quiet, and then gone entirely. Jonas had never seen a dust storm building before, but he'd heard enough old-timers describe the signs to recognize them now, one by one, arriving in the order they always did. He worked through what remained of the daylight without stopping. He checked every batten on the cabin roof, drove fresh wedges where the old ones had loosened, packed the last of his lime and clay mixture into a hairline gap along the north wall that the last hard wind had opened. He climbed the windmill tower one final time and set the brake fully, lashing it down with a second line in case the first gave way. Then covered the exposed gearing with oiled canvas against the grit that was already beginning to hang faint and dry in the air, even before the wind returned. By the time the light failed, the sky to the north had turned a bruised, moving gray, low and wide, swallowing the horizon the way floodwater swallows a low field. The storm hit a little after full dark, and it hit without patience. Wind slammed into the cabin's north wall in a single hard gust, then another, then a steady roar that didn't let up between breaths. Grit found every seam Jonas hadn't managed to seal, hissing against the windows, working its way under the door despite the rag he'd packed along the threshold. The roof battens held. He could hear them straining, groaning under each gust, but holding, the way Corwin Teague, the carpenter back in town, had sworn they wouldn't when he'd first seen the repairs. It was somewhere past midnight, in a lull between two gusts, that Jonas heard it. Faint under the wind, almost lost beneath it, but unmistakable to ears that had spent 4 years learning exactly this kind of sound. A knock. Not rhythmic, not steady. Off. Listen first. He was up the tower ladder before he'd fully decided to go. Wind tearing at his coat, grit stinging his eyes half shut. One hand locked on the rail the whole climb. The brake had held. The canvas had held. But somewhere in the gearing, under the strain of a wind stronger than anything Jonas had tested it against, a single tooth on the slow drive gear had begun to catch instead of turn clean. The same flaw, in miniature, that had cost him 4 days of water 2 weeks before. Left alone through a night of gusts like this, it wouldn't just bind, it would shear the tooth clean off and take the whole careful mechanism down with it. He worked by feel more than sight, canvas whipping against his shoulder, and eased the load off the catching tooth with the flat of a wrench, easing it through each gust instead of forcing it, exactly the way Silas had taught him to ease anything that wasn't ready to be forced. It took the better part of an hour, cold hands and colder wind, before the gear settled back into its clean, even turn. He was still on the tower when he saw the lantern light, small and frantic, bobbing across the yard below. By the time he reached the ground, Ruth was already at the cabin door, her sister Eleanor half carrying Sam against her hip, all three of them coated gray with dust, Eleanor's arm wrapped tight enough around her own shoulder that Jonas understood before she said anything that something had gone wrong at the homestead behind them. "Barn roof came down," Ruth said, shouting over the wind. "The wind pump's frozen. Hand pump, too. We couldn't stay." There wasn't time for more explanation than that, and none was needed. Jonas pulled the door open and stood aside, the way the ranch had never once, in all the years it stood empty, opened for anyone. The night that followed was less a single crisis than a long string of small ones, handled in order the way Jonas had learned to handle anything he didn't yet fully understand. He fed the stove hotter when smoke began backing down the chimney under the shifting wind, wedged a stone baffle into the firebox the way he'd read once in an old repair notebook of Silas's, and watched the draft steady again. He measured water carefully by lantern light, what remained in the barrel, what the well could still offer if it came to that, and portioned it out so that no one went without, and no one took more than the night required. Sam fell asleep sometime past 2, one hand curled loosely around the small wooden horse Jonas had sat on the porch rail weeks before, and, without quite deciding to, brought inside that evening and pressed into the boy's hands. Ruth sat near the stove through most of it, not sleeping, watching the door the way a person watches something they've decided not to be afraid of anymore. At one point, somewhere past 3 in the morning, when the worst of the gusts had begun to space further apart, she looked over at Jonas and said, quiet enough that it was almost lost under the wind, "You knew that gear was going before it went." "Heard it," Jonas said, "before I saw it." She didn't ask him to explain further. She didn't need to. The storm broke sometime before dawn, the wind easing off in stages until it was only a memory of itself, and by full light the basin lay coated gray-white with settled dust, fence lines half buried, the world outside the cabin door reshaped in ways that would take days to fully understand. Deadwell Ranch, nobody in town had ever called it anything else, still stood. The roof battens had held. The chinking had cracked in only a few hairline seams, nothing the next dry afternoon wouldn't let him patch. And above the yard, the windmill turned steady in the thin morning wind, its slow, even rhythm unbroken, as if the night before hadn't asked anything of it at all. Eleanor's homestead had fared worse. The barn roof was a loss, the hand pump frozen solid with grit that would take a full teardown to clear. Jonas walked back with him that morning, tools slung over Ember's back, and spent the better part of 2 days working through the pump the same patient way he'd worked through everything else. Not fast, not clever, just honest about what was actually broken before he touched it. Word moved through Millbrook Crossing the way it always did, faster than any single fact could keep up with. But this time it moved in a different direction than it had the day Jonas bought the ranch. Corwin Teague, the carpenter, rode out within the week, not to gloat, but to look. Climbing the tower himself, running a hand along the batten work, studying the slow, deliberate turn of the gearing, with the particular quiet of a man revising an opinion he'd been fairly loud about earlier. "Heard you had Calloway's people through the storm," he said, climbing back down. "Their barn came apart," Jonas said. "Wasn't much choice in it." Corwin studied the windmill a moment longer. "That thing turns slower than any mill I've seen." "It's supposed to." He didn't ask why, not that day. But he came back a week later with a broken hand pump from his own place, and didn't laugh once while Jonas walked him through what was wrong with it. Others followed, in 1s and 2s, over the following month. A rancher from the far side of the ridge with a mill that had never drawn quite right. A widow near the church whose well had gone the same slow, cloudy way Eleanor's had before Jonas fixed it. He didn't charge more than the work was worth, and he never claimed the slow drive design as his own invention when men asked how he'd thought of it. He told them the truth, plainly, the way Silas would have wanted it told. A man named Abram Voss had built it first, years before, out of a problem nobody else had bothered to solve because it was easier to call the ground dead than admit it just needed listening to. When the thing finally happened that Jonas had been quietly circling for weeks, a rancher named Holloway, the same man who'd laughed loudest outside the land office the day Jonas bought the place, standing in the yard with his hat in his hands, asking how in the world Jonas had known that gear was about to go, out there in the middle of a storm, before it had even started grinding. Jonas thought about it for a moment before he answered. Not because he didn't know, because the answer deserved the same care Silas had always given anything worth saying, only once. "I listened before I tried to fix it," he said. Holloway didn't have much to say back to that. He just nodded, slow, the way men do when an answer is smaller and truer than the question they expected. Jonas spent one evening in early autumn cutting a plank of cedar down to size, sanding the edges smooth by lamplight the way Silas had taught him to finish anything meant to last. He didn't carve much into it, just a name and the years he could piece together, and beneath that, a single line he'd turned over in his mind for weeks before deciding it was the only one that fit. He built it first. We just finished listening. He mounted the plank at the base of the tower, where anyone walking up from the yard would see it before they saw the mill turning above it. The ranch never became anything grand. A year on, it was still small, still plain, a working windmill, a mended cabin, a garden that survived because someone had finally taught Jonas the difference between having water and knowing what to do with it. Ember grew a little grayer around the muzzle and a little slower on the uphill walk to the ridge, and didn't seem to mind either. Sam kept the little wooden horse on the porch rail of his own house now, though he still came by most weeks to sit at the base of the tower and watch the blades turn, same as he always had. And every spring, when the ground finally softened enough to trust with new seed, Ruth came up the track with a sack over one shoulder, and Jonas walked the windmill's slow rhythm with her down toward the garden rows, and for an afternoon they traded what they each knew best. The water he could coax steady from thin, stubborn ground, and the dirt she knew how to make hold on to it once it was there. Neither of them ever called it anything more than that. It didn't need to be.